There's a ton of noise out there. So how do you get decision makers to pay attention to your brand? Start a podcast and invite your ideal clients to be guests on your show. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show.
Welcome back to Why Podcasts Work. Today, I'm joined by Ryan Estes. Ryan is the content marketing specialist at Frontline Education. He is also the host of the Field Trip podcast. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jonathan. It's good to be here.
It's a pleasure to get connected with you. I'm thrilled to talk about your podcast today, the Field Trip podcast, and talk about some of the benefits that you've seen from it. But Ryan, before we do sort of get into the benefits, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your show, about the podcast.
Certainly. Well, I'm part of a team of about 4 or 5 content marketers here at Frontline Education. And one of the challenges that we realized is as we market to K-12 leaders in school districts and schools all across the country is, what do we want to talk to them about? And this is a very highly educated audience. And we have found that, if you have a doctorate in education, what am I, who I do not have a degree in education, how am I going to speak about something substantive to this audience? And so what we found is that, interviewing and telling stories from people who are actually doing incredible work in the K-12 space is really a great way for us to be able to provide value to our audience and to our clients who are listening to this podcast without having to go and spend an incredible amount of hours doing research and reading. We're able to tell human stories about the kinds of things that our clients are going to find valuable. And that is one of the reasons why we just thought the podcast makes so much sense, because this medium really lends itself to storytelling.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, I love, I personally love when sort of storytelling can come together with providing that real value, and it's such a beautiful intersection. So I'm thrilled that you guys have found it. Ryan, let's talk then a little bit about maybe where you've seen the biggest benefit from your podcast.
Oh boy, that is hard to narrow down because there really have been quite a number of them. You actually interviewed one of my bosses, Ken Pratt, who's our vice president of marketing, a little while ago, and I believe he was talking to you about sort of how we measure the results of all of our content marketing across the board when it comes to lead generation. And one of the things that we have sort of talked a lot about as a department is, okay, what sort of benefit does doing what is often called thought leadership, what sort of benefit does that bring to the company in terms of business results? And what benefit does talking about our software solutions bring if we talk about them in a more specific, hey, we have a solution to your problem? Which of these is the better way to go? And we have started doing what is often called multi-touch attribution, where we're able to track every piece of content and be able to identify, here is actually how these bring leads in the door, even when they're not put out there specifically for the purposes of lead generation. And one of the interesting things that we have found is that many people engage with the podcast, they listen to it, and it actually has a lot of the leads that come in the door. Those folks have already engaged with the podcast, have subscribed or have downloaded or have interacted with the emails that we send out promoting it. And so we've really been able to see, of the people who raise their hand and say, yes, I'm really interested in what Frontline software can do for my organization, a lot of these folks have already engaged with other pieces of content further upstream, including the podcast, which has really been something that was gratifying to see, because we did not set out to talk about our products or our solutions in the podcast. We're solely telling stories of what people are doing, of how people are creatively solving problems or how they're innovating in their school district. And we're often using examples of data, but we're not talking about, hey, here's what our stuff is doing.
Yeah.
Instead, we're saying, hey, here's someone who's doing something really creative and interesting. And as we do that, and as we've been positioning ourselves as partners with education, as we've been positioning our company as people who really care about the front line of education, that seems to have resonated, and that has ultimately had an effect on leads coming in the door.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's one of the things that we talk about all the time, and it feels like you are very aligned with the thought of, hey, let's provide value first. We're not setting out to produce 45-minute frontline education commercials.
Would you listen to that podcast?
Yeah, right.
Right.
So it's brilliant that you are providing value first, and sort of as a result, like you said, that this lead generation has become such a powerful part of the podcast, and people are talking about your software, your service. I know there were, in terms of benefits, in terms of results, we've sort of touched on it a little bit. Certainly the content development, the added business, the lead generation. I know there was also an aspect of personal branding. Can we talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So about a year and a half ago, I was asked by one of our vice presidents in marketing to create a series of podcasts solely to be used for internal training here at Frontline about a number of the things that are going on, that initiatives that we're undertaking as a company to train our employees and talk to them about some of the things that are going on. And that seems to have been a success. And I certainly enjoyed putting them together. And as we began just talking about what it looks like to create content, this was a medium that we had success with internally, and we thought, let's give this a shot and see what it looks like to put something out there that's client facing, or that's has a broader audience. And I tell you, that has led both through the podcast as well as doing other presentations at the company or being involved in things like this, has really led to, it's opened a lot of doors for me personally at work, which has been fantastic, whether it be just people recognizing, hey, here's a skill that we can use, whether it's other people in other departments saying, you know what, I think this is something that I would like to try. Can we talk about this? It certainly has, I would say it's been nothing but a good thing for me personally in my career.
That's fantastic. And one of the questions that we also like to ask, especially when it comes to people that are relatively new to the podcasting world, not to say that your podcast is in its infancy, but you definitely get a different perspective about any maybe unexpected benefits that you've seen from having a podcast.
Yeah, so I've mentioned that we use this as a source of content. One of the things that we've really found helpful is to be able to start with a podcast and then say, take that transcript and turn it into a blog post or turn it into an ebook, or continue to use that and repurpose the content in other ways. The podcast has really been a fantastic source of value for content in other areas. So that's certainly been one of them. But another one has been, just even though these podcasts are created for an external audience, I've heard from a lot of people that they've been helpful for an internal audience as well, whether it be simply shedding light on some of the things that our client districts are doing, simply shedding light on some of the things that are happening in K-12, giving people a picture of, okay, who is it that we're really serving here? Oh, these are the people that our software is really trying to help them in their jobs. And that has been really interesting to hear from people in a variety of departments at Frontline, that they've been able to get a picture of what's going on, that from a vantage point that they might not have had before.
That is so cool to think that, not only have there been unexpected benefits externally, but that it's also been an internal resource as well, which I think is just fantastic. Ryan, the last thing I want to ask is if you have any recommendations for a company that's maybe looking to start their own podcast. It can feel a little bit like a daunting task. You don't know where to start. You don't know what you're doing. What sort of recommendations might you have for someone that's thinking about this?
Oh, that's a great question. And yes, it certainly can be a daunting thing. And by all means, there are lots of resources online to help people get connected with the technical aspects of starting a podcast. I know that transom.org has a ton of articles that I found very helpful. Sweetfish Media, of course, had some stuff that was helpful for me. But I would also say that there's always going to be a drift to talking about the things that you want to talk about as a company, right? As a company that makes software, we want to let people know about the software that we are creating. However, as I alluded to earlier, I personally wouldn't listen to a podcast that's a commercial. There are so many podcasts out there, and we all have limited time. I'm going to listen to the stories that are entertaining, that are informative, that are helpful to me, that provide value to me, regardless of whether or not I'm going to purchase a given product. And so what we really wanted to do with Field Trip was to be able to tell these stories that were helpful to people and valuable to people, regardless of whether they were our clients, that were entertaining, that people would actually want to listen to in their cars on the way home from work. And that would be one of my biggest pieces of advice is try to find the interesting stories in your market that you can highlight that will bring value, that you don't feel like you need to say, oh, and by the way, you should buy all of our stuff. Yes, we're in this because we're in marketing. And yes, we're in this because we want to make an impact on our company's bottom line. But at Frontline, we also we really care about education, and we want to be able to provide stories that are going to be useful and valuable to people who are in education, regardless of whether or not they're clients. And hopefully that generates business action. But at the same time, that's not our sole purpose for doing it. And I think that as we do that, it really does help people see that we're genuine about the things that we're talking about. We don't have, all these ulterior motives. We really care about the things that we're talking about.
Yeah, genuine. I mean, you took the words right out of my mouth. I was going to say, it's the genuineness that really comes across, and you're able to provide that value, and everyone wins at the end of the day. So, Ryan, certainly we wish you all the continued success with the Field Trip podcast. You are certainly a master storyteller. Again, in addition to the content marketing specialist at Frontline Education, we've been talking with Ryan Estes. Ryan, thank you so much for your time. It was an absolute pleasure getting to interview you on the show today.
Thanks, Jonathan. Great being here.
We totally get it. We publish a ton of content on this podcast, and it can be a lot to keep up with. That's why we've started the B2B Growth Big Three, a no-fluff email that boils down our 3 biggest takeaways from an entire week of episodes. Sign up today at sweetfishmedia.com/big3. That's sweetfishmedia.com/big3.